Hello, this is Joan Fernley, your French diction coach for choirs, and today I will be reading L'Adieu des Bergers à la Sainte Famille by Hector Berlioz, otherwise known as the Shepherd's Farewell from the piece L'Enfance du Christ. Now there's plenty of information on this composer and this particular piece out there on the internet readily available, so I won't cover that in this particular video, and I will go straight into the reading, the tips for conductors and singers, and then finally the coaching where I work on the piece line by line, and you can stick around for that. Now, this is one of these staples of the choral canon that I hope every singer and conductor gets to do at least once or twice or three times in their careers. It's really a beautiful piece, but it is challenging. And yes, this piece is available in English, and some choirs choose to do it in English. There's no shame in that. Of course, I encourage you to do it in French. These are Berlioz's own words. If you really want to get up close and personal with what he had in mind, you would do it in French. But again, I recognize sometimes our resources and our time is limited. So one of the strategies you can do, especially if you have fairly stable membership, is 1 year you do it in English and you get all the musical challenges out of the way. And then a couple of years later, you introduce the French. So you can think of this as a longer term project. So if you like what I do, please like, share, and subscribe just to encourage me to make more videos, and let's get started. As this piece is from the 19th century, I will be rolling my R's on the tip of my tongue. Il s'en va loin de la terre, où dans l'étable il vit le jour. De son père et de sa mère, qu'il reste le constant amour. Qu'il grandisse, qu'il prospère, et qu'il soit bon père à son tour. Que si chez l'idolâtre, il vient à sentir le malheur, fuyant la terre marâtre, chez nous qu'il revienne au bonheur. Que la pauvreté du pâtre reste toujours chère à son cœur. Cher enfant, Dieu te bénisse. Dieu vous bénisse, heureux époux. Que jamais de l'injustice vous ne puissiez sentir les coups. Un bon ange vous avertisse des dangers planant sur vous. So now it's time for the tips and tricks for singers and conductors. And this piece is quite wordy. It uses words that may not even be common to Francophone singers. And so I've amassed quite a few tips and tricks for this particular song, and I've grouped them in 4 categories. And the first one is about pitch and forward placement of sound. So this isn't quite about diction when you think of it. In fact, it's universal. And in this piece, there are a series of note progressions that seem to drag the pitch down, and it is quite literally can be flat, but sometimes it's just the sound. It seems to lack sparkle. It's like drinking champagne without the bubbles. It just falls literally flat. And that is often because the sound is placed too far back in the throat, not forward enough. And that forward placement is actually very important to French. It'll pay off in all your singing, but it's especially important for French. So here up on the screen, I have a bit of anatomy. And what I will be doing is focusing on the area I've circled in pink. And what you see here is the airflow in blue. And you have the hard palate that I've outlined in pink. And that we don't tend to talk about the hard palate nearly as much as we talk about the soft palate. But the soft palate is further back. And if you're singing a vowel that is on the darker side, it does go back. And if you're trying to open up the soft palate and you're putting all your attention in the back, you will lose that forward placement. So you really want to aim for that very deep part of the hard palate, and it sort of sits somewhere under the base of the nose. And that will clarify the sound. And just not think so much about the back of the throat where the soft palate is. I'll take a phrase to explain it. It'll be a bit exaggerated, but if I were to read this phrase with sort of that yawning, open, soft palate in the back, it would sound like this. Il s'en va loin de la terre, où dans l'étable il vit le jour. And it just sounds a bit odd, and it doesn't have that French quality. Now, it sounds a bit silly, but if I were to do this with a forward placement, I would say, Il s'en va loin de la terre, où dans l'étable il vit le jour. So now our tip number 2 is all about the family of O sounds. Whether O or oo or on, they're all part of the same family. We have here the full set of lyrics, and these are the words that we will focus on in this O family. So the first one is the basic closed O sound, which sounds just like go. And in this second verse of the song, we have 2 instances, and they are O and pauvreté. And funny enough, they are spelled A-U, not O. Now, the second one is the open O sound, as in stop. So you're basically opening up that closed O, and there's a bit of ah that sneaks into it, but you don't want it to go too far onto an ah sound unless you're aiming for a specific accent like stop. But in singing, especially in the 19th century, you would go for an oh sound. You still need that O quality. In this piece, the first verse and the second verse, you will find 3 cases of that open O sound. And these words are prospère, idolâtre, and bonheur. So both sounds, the closed and the open O, are easy to do in English. The tricky part is figuring out which is which. And there are rules, but sometimes rules are broken. So it's just best to note those directly in your score. Now, interesting note is the composer of this piece has the 2 O sounds. So you can tie that in as an interesting reference point as well. So we have the open O on Hector, and we have the closed O on Berlioz. Hector Berlioz. Our third member of the O family is the nasalized O, which sounds like on. And you will typically see this open O letter, and that signals an open O with the little squiggly that signals that it is nasalized. And I've used that symbol in the past, but I have since purchased this book, which I will link below. And this book is fantastic. It's a bit on the expensive side, but it is an absolute wonderful reference for all your French pronunciation, specifically for singing. And so the author has pointed out a lot of useful things to know. And she uses the closed O. And I agree much more with that, and it'll all become clear. And this is the symbol I'm going to use. So you'll see both, but my preference is definitely the closed O. So how do you do this sound? It doesn't really exist in the English language so much, but you can think of this sound as geese and just go honk, honk, and just make it sort of round and honk, honk, and just round it up. There are four occurrences of this sound in verses 1 and 2, and you will see one word comes up 3 times. So you will have bon, son, constant, and onc. Now you can see why I prefer the closed O symbol, because if you notice, my lips have rounded and I do start with that O sound that I then nasalized, O, on. Now there's 2 typical mistakes that I come across when singers are singing the nasalized on. And the first one is they open it too much, which may be because they've been reading the IPA symbols with that open O. And so they'll say bon, son, constant, onc, but it doesn't sound French. So you really want to aim for the closed O that you nasalized, bon, and so on. Now, the second mistake that I often hear is singers voicing the N sound. So especially when you have syllables that follow. So take, for example, the word constant. And what I will hear now and then is constant. The singers will vocalize the N. That is incorrect. The N is only there to nasalize the O. It is not voiced as a separate consonant on its own. So whatever you do, perhaps consider crossing out the N and perhaps putting a squiggly on top of the O so that you know that it is an O sound, but you should not pronounce the N. Now, you might wonder why I omitted these two cases. And the reason is that they're a bit of an exception. And the rule is simple, is that you use the open O sound if bon is a kind of prefix that is followed by an H or a vowel. So it's a simple rule. It sounds a bit complicated when it's explained, but basically if you see an H or a vowel after the N of bon, it will become an O sound. It is not nasal at all, and it is an open O. Now, with the word bon ange, you have the liaison that's there. And so that is your signal that you think of that as a single word. And that's why we don't say bon ange or bon ange. We say bon ange. Now, the next one in the family of the O sounds is the oo sound. And visually, you see a U in the IPA symbol there, but it is sort of part of that family. And think of this as a very formal way of saying who. So it's not who, but it's who. And again, you can think of this as an owl, who. So it's very sing-songy, it is very forward, and it's in that top part, that sort of cathedral ceiling of the hard palate where you will get a really nice oo sound. So you really want to round the lips around that sort of O, but bring in the oo. Ooh. And it's really important to get this right because it comes up a lot in this song. So you'll have it come up at every rhyme of the verse 1 and 3. And also it comes up a few places here and there in the song. Ultimately, the 9 words that you have here that have this sound are coup. And you don't pronounce the P in there. It's coup, vous, nous, amour, ou, époux, toujours, jour, and tour. So make sure you get your oo just right so that you can get those sounds to sound really, really, truly French. Now, I'd like to take a minute or two to talk about words that are often mistakenly pronounced as oo. And you'll find them here highlighted in blue. And these words are fuyant, puissier, dû, sur, and injustice. So it's not an oo, it is an U sound. And U is really tricky for English choirs simply because U is not in the English language. And the way you find your U is start with E. And when you're doing an E sound, the tongue really curls forward. And you'll feel that tension in sort of the front area of the tongue. E. And then you just round E, U. And really don't be shy to round. Now, want to bring your attention specifically to fuyant and puissier, because what's going on here is you have the I, that E sound that is added, but it's not fuyant. It's not an U sound followed by E. It is an U sound followed by E. And fuyant and puissier are very tricky. And the way you can practice this is just drop the F, drop the P, work on your vowels only, and only then bring back the consonant, the starting consonant. So just work on uyant, uyant, and even you can break it down, iant, uyant, and then fuyant, and do the same thing with puissier. Your third tip is how to pronounce the sound where you see an E followed by U. And these can also be tricky. And you'll find 2 different ways to pronounce this. You'll find an open way and you'll find the closed way. So how does this work? For the open sound, it is malheur, bonheur, and cœur. And these are simply open sound, like saying the word the. Or you can think of saying Sir, so Sir Lancelot, or something like that. It's just but you do pronounce the R in this case. You'll do malheur, bonheur, and cœur. Now for the closed version, it's an E sound, which is, again, it's a bit like trying to do an U. So you start with E, you do U. You can start with and you do E. And the tongue will still have a bit more tension and curl a bit more forward to get that E sound. Make sure you don't substitute an oo or anything like that. It is an E sound. Your fourth tip is all about the A with the accent on top, the accent circonflexe. And so it's that little hat on top of the A. And you'll find it in 3 instances in the rhymes in verse 2. And this is the darker ah sound, ah, and it contrasts against the open ah. With the A, with the accent on top, which is darker, you have these words here. You have idolâtre, marâtre, and pâtre. So in spoken French, in many, many regions, that darker sound has actually slipped away and it has migrated towards the ah sound. So you might hear francophones speaking and you won't be able to distinguish between the two. You'll hear idolâtre, marâtre, and pâtre. And it's not necessarily incorrect, but in 19th century, that distinction has to be clear. Okay, this is the coaching session where I will work through the whole piece line by line. Il s'en va loin de la terre. So first off, with the end of that line, you will see a lot of E's at the end of phrases, and those most of the time will be pronounced, but they're very light. So you don't want to emphasize them, and you certainly don't want to make them dark. So a mistake that I hear sometimes will be an sound instead of an sound. Terre, terre. So it's just not emphasized and it's not closed. So at the beginning also you have il sent, ah. You have that nasal ah sound. So you begin with an ah, 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 by just dropping the soft palate a little bit, and that will give you the nasalized ah sound. Il s'en va. And now, again, as I said in the tips and tricks, most of the ahs that you will see will be a bright ah, the open ah, and not the ah, the closed ah. They're very subtle, but they are distinct. Il s'en va loin, ah, and there's a w that comes just before it. Next line, où dans l'étable il vit le jour. So you'll notice there's a lot of liaison throughout this piece, but not for everything. So I did put them up on the screen and you can just make a note of that. So the first one is ooh. So you have a nice round ooh sound, and we had a lot of those. Ooh, nice owl sound. Dans, which is just like sans. And then les tables, so you have the A sound, which is the more closed E sound. Établil. So we just drop the E and we just link it to the il. L'établil vit. So those E sounds are the same. Il and vi, it's identical. And you don't pronounce the T, it's a silent T. Il vit le jour. And of course, in these cases, you do roll the R at the end. That R is voiced, but voiced very lightly. The next line, de son père et de sa mère. So père and mère are identical in pronunciation, except, of course, the beginning consonant. So you have that R sound. And the E is pronounced, but in the case of père, it is linked right through the A sound. So we sort of drop that extra E. De son, that on sound. Père, de sa, nice bright A, mère. Then the next line, qu'il reste le constant amour. So we have that linking between constant amour. Now, of course, be mindful not to voice the N in the word constant. That O and that N go together to form that nasalized closed O. Constant. It's not constant. Then we have qu'il grandisse, qu'il prospère. So again, we have qu'il, so that's just like a K sound. Grandisse, you have the A, the nasalized A sound, which we've seen already. Grandisse, the S is going to be light, just like reste before. And then we have qu'il prospère, so it's an open O sound, and R at the end of prospère is just like père and mère. Then we have et qu'il soit bon père à son tour. Soit is the first time we're seeing that sound. It's an A sound, a dark A, a closed A, and it is preceded by a bit of a W before. Soit, wa. Bon, we've seen that. In this case, because bon is on its own, it's not that special rule where we would say bonne. It is bon. Et qu'il soit bon père à son tour. Then we have onque. Onque. And then you don't pronounce that S at the end of onque. Then you have si, chez. So that EZ is an A sound. So it's one sound. Chez l'idolâtre. So we start with an open O on idolâtre, idole. And then we have the closed A on the rest of the word. Idolâtre. Il vient à sentir le malheur. So this is actually fairly straightforward at this point. We have il, which you've seen. Now vient is new. It's this un sound, which is really just an that becomes nasalized. Un, vi, and then there's the I. Vient. And then we link the T. Il vient à sentir le malheur. So we have that open sound on the EU. Malheur. Fuyant la terre marâtre, marâtre. So we have that tricky one because we have the open A at the beginning of the word and then we have the closed A at the end, marâtre. So you really want to practice that. But we also have the tricky word fuyant, which I explained in the tips and tricks. So just a little reminder, it's an U sound. Make sure you're not doing an OU sound. Fuyant la terre marâtre. Chez nous, qu'il revienne au bonheur. So at this point, these are all sounds you've seen. Chez, which has that accent A sound. Nous, nice OU. Qu'il revienne au bonheur. And here we don't say bonheur, we say bonheur. Que la pauvreté du pâtre. So here we have the example of the AU sound that is the closed O sound. Pauvreté du pâtre. And pâtre is just like marâtre, idolâtre. And then finally, reste toujours cher à son cœur. So these are words you've seen, but I'm just going to spend a bit of time talking about cœur. And the O that's there in front of the E really typically trips people up. And they read it as cour. So what you want to imagine, and if it helps, just cross out the O and read it as C-E-U-R, or better yet, K-E-U-R. Cœur, and make sure that it rhymes with bonheur and malheur. Then you have cher enfant, Dieu te bénisse. Now, enfant, those two sounds, one of them is with an E and the other is with the A. You have the two sounds, but they're identical. It's both the nasalized A. Enfant. You just stick an F in between and you don't pronounce the T. And of course, you have the liaison, cher enfant. Dieu. So now we have that closed EU sound. And of course, we have the E sound that comes before, which can trip people up, and I'll hear things like Dieu. But it's Dieu. So make sure you get the E and take it really slowly. E, and just work with that. Then we have te bénisse. And se on bénisse in this line is pronounced very lightly. But you'll notice on the next line, it's not even pronounced. So we have Dieu vous bénisse. And the reason is simply because there are just not enough notes in the piece. And the reason I'm insisting on that as well on bénisse is because if you didn't have the comma there, you would do a liaison. You would do Dieu vous bénisse, heureux époux. But the comma that's there forces you to have that glottal start on heureux. Dieu vous bénisse, heureux époux. Que jamais de l'injustice. So que is a sound that you've seen. It's the sound. Que jamais sound. And just like père, mère, jamais. It's the same Jamais de l'injustice. You have an U sound, l'injustice. Vous ne puissiez sentir les coups. Now, puissiez is the other one, and it's really hard because you've got an extra I in there. So you have puissiez, and so there's just a lot going on. And don't try to do it all at once. Take it apart, just like I suggested in fuyant. Vous ne puissiez sentir les coups. And then, que bon ange vous avertisse. Now, this again is that rule on bon. If it was bon was on its own, you would say bon. But because it's followed by ange and there is a liaison, we almost treat that as a single word. So bon is followed by a vowel. It is bon ange. Que it's nasal. Bon ange vous avertisse. And then the last line, des dangers. So a sound, and the R makes the E sound like danger, and the S is silent. Plat, nice open A, planant sur, then you have an U sound there, vous. Des dangers planant sur vous. Well, there you have it, l'adieu des bergers à la Sainte Famille. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, bye!